Let's start our in-depth tour of the Control Center console with policy authoring. We will not discuss all the details of policy authoring because that would require a video of its own. We are going to focus, however, on some of the high-level concepts that you must understand before you can start creating your first policies. The first thing we need to do is understand our use cases. We will navigate to the Policy Validator and take a look at the two simple use cases we have for our finance documents. For today, we simply want to make sure that finance documents can only be opened by finance users. We have two use cases here. For the first one, we have Anne, who is from the finance department, trying to open the balance ledger. Since Anne is from the finance department, she should be allowed to do so. We also have a use case for Jane, who is from the IT department, wanting to open the same file. But since she is not from the finance department, she should be denied. Let's see the results of these test cases before we deploy any policies. As you can see, without any policies in place, both users will be able to open a document, and as such, our second test case failed. Now let's create our policies. We will need to return to the Policy Studio. The first thing we need to do is define our component types. Component types correspond to the different resource types and subject types that we're going to be using in the solution. Control Center provides three different subject types: users, hosts, and application. Subjects are the doers of the action, and these component types define what are the different attributes that we can collect from these doers of action. For example, right now, our solution is configured to collect department and job function from the user, along with some predefined attributes such as Windows SID, Unix SID, mail, last name, first name, and display name. It is important for the policy author to know what attributes are available for him before he starts creating policies. We have also prepared a resource type, which we call Policy Validator. We create one resource type for each enforcer that you are using in the solution. So for this particular resource type, which we call Policy Validator, this application is able to return to us the classification and which department a document belongs to. After you have defined the different component types, we need to create the different components. There are three types of components: subject, resource, and action. Subject components are the logical grouping of the doers of the action. As mentioned earlier, we want to create a policy that would restrict access to financial documents. Therefore, I would like to know who the finance users are so that I can allow them from accessing the finance documents. Based on my user component type, I know that I can use a department attribute to determine what department the user is coming from. Knowing that, I could create my subject component for the finance department. Since the doer of the action is the user, I'm going to use user as my subject type, and I'm going to call this finance department. I'm going to set the condition where the department is equal to finance. I'm going to save this and deploy it. Now that I have defined my subject component, the next thing for me to do is define my resource component. In creating a resource component, you need to select what type of resource you are using. In our case, we want to create a resource component for Policy Validator. Next, we need to specify the criteria to determine which files should be considered as finance documents. In our case, we're going to use the condition department is equal to finance. Again, I'm going to save and deploy this component. Now that I have both components, I can start creating my policies. When you're just starting with creating your policies, I would suggest starting with a blanket deny policy. The blanket deny policy will deny access to all the documents you're trying to control for everyone. Then we can make additional sub-policies to define exceptions as to who should be allowed. Let me show you how that works. I'm going to deny access to finance documents, so the policy effect should be deny. And in my subject components, I won't put anything here yet. And in my resource documents, I'm just going to say finance documents. At this point, there are no other configuration that we need to put in our parent policy, so I'm just going to go ahead and save and deploy this one. We will have to wait for a few moments as our demo environment is configured to check for new policies once every minute. I can make use of the administrator view to take a quick look if our policy has already been deployed or not. By going to the policy controller status, I can see if my policy controllers are up to date, and if they are, then we can proceed with our test cases. So now I'm going to run the same test cases, but this time we have the blanket deny policy. So now you will see that both users, Anne and Jane, are actually denied from accessing the document. So while we have satisfied the condition for our second use cases, we still have to create a sub-level policy for our parent policy so that we can also satisfy the first use case. So I'm going back to our Policy Studio to create the second policy. I'll open the same deny policy that we have just created and go to the Hierarchy tab. From here, I can create a sub-policy. This sub-policy should allow finance users. Here, my policy effect is allow, and in the subject components, I'm going to add the finance department. It's not mandatory to add the finance documents component here anymore, but for the sake of ease of understanding, I'll just go ahead and add them. And now I'm going to save and deploy this policy. Again, we'll have to wait for a few minutes. And once that's done, I'm going to go back to our Policy Validator. I'm going to run the same test cases again. And this time, you'd see that both our test cases have passed. Anne is allowed to access a document because she is from the finance department, and Jane, who is from the IT department, is denied. So join us again next time where we take a look at other features of the Control Center console and probably try other more complicated policies.